Hello, everyone. It's Frances Widdowson here. The video today that I'm going to do is on the actual deaths that have been documented for the Kamloops Indian Residential School. And this is a very important area of research, which has been spearheaded by the incredible researcher Nina Green. And you can look at her website, Residential School Records, to get a much fuller picture of everything that's going on across the country with respect to the primary research on residential schools. But my area of expertise is the Kamloops case, and I have looked at these uh, records for a number of years, but there's been some new developments over the last couple of months, which I wanted to share with you, as well as bringing in a number of different documents to help tell the story about what actually happened at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. And what we're going to see is that with the announcement that occurred on May 27th, 2021, when the Kamloops Indian Band stated that the remains of 215 children have been confirmed, and then the Kamloops Indian Band stated in July 2021 to the Assembly of First Nations that actually a mass grave had been found, and this was an indication of a pattern of genocide. There's been a constant confusion that has been perpetrated by academics like Keisha Supernant and Sean Carlton, which try to confuse the issue of the clandestine burials, which it was implied to be the case in May of 2021, and then continuing for several years, and the situation of the actual deaths at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. So what I've done is I've done a post on the wokeacademy.info site with all of the documents. And what I would like to do is just to go through these documents with you, to show you what they mean, and so you can have a better understanding of what is going on with respect to this area. So what we're in right now, just so people are not familiar with the wokeacademy.info site, www.wokeacademy.info. If you go into that website, you'll see a whole bunch of different menu items. Has a lot of incredible information about the arbitration decision and my firing, largely, but I also want to do some things on the Kamloops grave error. And you'll notice on the right-hand side that there's a number of posts that have been put up there. And the one that we're interested in is the post deaths associated with the Kamloops Indian Residential School. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to click on this link, and you will see that this is the post that I have done with respect to this issue. And that was done this morning. So it's November 8th, 2025. And you'll notice here that the post starts with a post by Dr. Gabrielle Lindstrom, who now goes by her maiden name, Gabrielle Weaselhead. And for people who are unfamiliar with Gabrielle Weaselhead, she is the professor at Mount Royal University who tried to mobilize an anonymous, supposedly student-led group against me, tried to get me fired. And while she was doing this, she used language like she is right in this post, which is, about how she's interested in love, kindness, and compassion. And while she was trying to get me fired, actually, she claimed to be loving and kind and trying to bring people together with humility and grace. And as a result of that, I couldn't take that seriously. And so I satirized her claims about being loving and kind and trying to bring people together with humility and grace. And one of the things that really annoyed Gabrielle Weaselhead was that I was not accepting the idea that the residential schools were genocidal. And this, she thought, and I'm not sure the exact reason why she was opposed to this, but presumably it would be some indication of racism and discrimination, which was the common charge that Weaselhead would make about these things. But as you can see from this post, which was made in May 2021, shortly after the announcement about by the Kamloops band, is she states here, after crying about the 215 little ones who were murdered in that residential school. So she's making the leap that the confirmation of the remains of 215 children that the Kamloops band falsely stated is an indication that they were murdered. And she called her mother, who's a residential school survivor, that's the language that's used, to remind me that love, kindness, and compassion can't be killed. The spirits of those who didn't make it inspire me to heal and to always choose love. So Weaselhead was at the University of Calgary at this time, a professor there. Oh no, I think she's a consultant in Indigenous ways of knowing. This was the kind of response that many people had, because they assumed that clandestine burials meant foul play and, in all likelihood, children being murdered at that site. Anyway, so that's just to give you a sense that everyone who's trying to deny that there was some kind of attempt by the Kamloops Indian band to claim that children had been murdered or something nefarious had happened to them, this is just not correct. This is the logical interpretation that people would have if they heard that message and they weren't already kind of primed to be skeptical of claims that were being made by Aboriginal groups. So now that we have this this claim that, you know, murdered children, children who died through violence or some kind of nefarious process, what we're seeing is there's a kind of a constant confusion that is happening with the conflation of this circumstance, the clandestine burials, and student deaths. So no one is denying that students died at various residential schools. As has been said many times by all sorts of researchers in the residential school research group, diseases were a serious problem and there weren't antibiotics that existed at the time. So death rates tended to be high for children and especially high for Aboriginal children because of a lack of immunity, often poor nutrition and so on. And that was the same that existed in the residential schools. Now, it is often claimed by people like Peter Bryce that not enough was done to try to protect children. This is definitely an issue that we need to talk about and discuss. And I think that almost everyone that I know who's researching on the residential schools would say more should have been done to try to protect children from dying from disease or perhaps because of accidents. But what we are seeing is a confusion of the disease and accidents, deaths with the clandestine burials and the inference that is being made that children were murdered. And this is what's referred to in military parlance as the Motte and Bailey. And you see the Motte and Bailey here in this diagram here, is that what you have is you have the Bailey, which is a fertile area, a valley, farmland, and that's the sought after area. And then you have the defensive posture, which is the Motte, which is a dark and dank castle that people go to defend their position. They don't want to live there all the time. That's not what they're seeking out. And what we have is, in terms of the Bailey, is a bold, controversial claim. And that is the claim about the murders and the clandestine burials. And then what'll happen is when you see people challenge this claim, then you will have people like Sean Carlton and Keisha Supernaut revert to the obvious, uncontroversial statement that children died at the residential school. And with respect to the Bailey, which is the bold, controversial claim, this was actually made by Roseanne Casimir on July 2021. And people like Terry Glavin have downplayed this situation for years, trying to absolve the band of any responsibility for perpetuating this claim about mass graves. But as we see from the annual General Assembly on June 6th, 7th, and 8th, we have Roseanne Casimir moving and have this resolution that a mass grave discovered at the former Kamloops Indian Residential School reveals Crown conduct reflecting a pattern of genocide. So that is the Bailey, which is the bold, controversial claim. And then when what's become apparent is that over a number of years, it's become evident that there's no evidence for the claim of clandestine burials. We have not one parent who says that their child went missing. We have no evidence of foul play. And so therefore, this claim about 215 little ones who were murdered is completely without foundation. And people like Dr. Weaselhead should be retracting that statement and saying, oops, I made a mistake, and sorry for fomenting all the, trauma in Aboriginal communities, which claims like this were doing. And all we have for this is the hits on the GPR, and then the stories of the knowledge keepers. That's the only evidence. And as we're going to see, the claims of the knowledge keepers are often unreliable. They've often been listening to Kevin Annett's tales. This has kind of implanted memories in people, as well as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission did a lot of this, right? They had people primed to think that all these horrible things had happened, and therefore, this has been readily accepted. And as I found when I went to the University of Winnipeg in, was October, I guess, of 2000 of this year, 2025, September, sorry, that was September. I talked to many elders there, and all of them thought that children were buried in the apple orchard. So this is still a deeply entrenched belief that is going to take some effort to try to dislodge. But with the academics like Sean Carlton and Keisha Supernaut, what we saw was a mot. When they felt that the Bailey was being challenged, they deployed the mot, which is, in Sean Carlton's words, church and state records have already confirmed 51 deaths at KIRS. And so what he's doing with that statement is that Carlton is pretending that the fact that we have confirmed deaths at KRS, this somehow is support for the Kamloops Band's claim in May 2021, when they're completely separate issues. And you can see Carlton's post about this, because what happened was that Jonathan Kay, who is the editor of Colette, he was taking CTV News to task for this 215 possible unmarked graves discovery. Like the language that's being used is absurd language. You don't discover possible unmarked graves. That's just trying to distort things. Anyway, he's legitimately asking questions about this and kind of criticizing CTV about this. And, what does Carlton do but castigate John Kay? And he does it through the Mott and Bailey. He provides the Mott, which is about that, that there's these 51 deaths confirmed. You can see that right there, as 51 deaths are confirmed at KRS. And he's trying to say that's kind of denialism. It's kind of criticizing people who are trying to analyze this constant perpetuation of falsehoods that's going on. And this is just sophistry, because, as I mentioned here, no one's disputing that there's deaths. The only thing that we need to figure out is the actual numbers, what the circumstances were, these kinds of things. And there's been a number of efforts to do this. Not Carlton, of course, because he's just interested in castigating people as residential school denialists. He really is a sad excuse for an academic. But we have had actual professors, academics, doing work on this. One of them being Jacques Riard, who is a University of Montreal historian. He published an article in January 2022 based upon the research that was undertaken by Nina Green. And what I've done is I've just linked these articles. So you can go into the hyperlink and you will be able to see that this is the article actually by Riard that you can read, which is a very, very good article, as I said, mentioned, based on the work of Nina Green. So those links are all provided, but I just have the screenshot here. And then we have what Riard, based on Nina Green's research, shows is that there were 49 deaths, so not 51 that Carlton was referring to, 49 because there's duplicates in the names, which Nina found when she was going through all these records. And according to Riard, the 49 children, 35 of the 49 students, 17 died in hospital and 8 on their own reserves as a result of illness or accidents. That's what he found in 2022, January 2022. Nina Green, however, has been dogged on this file, so she kept on doing research on this and compiled a spreadsheet in 2023. And what she does, she goes through all the 51 records that's on the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation website. They have that on that website. They have all these names and the dates that they died. And she shows on this spreadsheet that she's compiled, which I've just reproduced here with a few added, kind of highlighted items. Of the 40 deaths records located, so we're missing, so there's 49, we're missing 9 death records, it sounds like. Only 4 students died at the actual Kamloops Indian Residential School. So this has now been substantiated by her. And the 4 are 2, this is number 2. So that number 2 is just the numbers that I've used over here. So you'll notice on the left-hand side, I've just numbered them so that we can keep track. Adrian Reynolds G. George died of asphyxia. Number 34, which you'll see down here, which is blue, it's the blue highlighting, 34. You'll notice that it's Margaret Falardeau. It says pericarditis. You have Pearl Joe drowned. I believe she was swimming, but some people are kind of arguing that it's more nefarious than that, trying to escape. I'm not sure what the situation is. And then we have finally number 48, which is Billy Theophile Dick, who died of tuberculosis, meningitis. Okay, and so, and those yellow highlighting, the yellow highlighting here is the duplicates that that Nina discovered when she was going through all these records. Okay, so and that's what I mentioned. The blue highlighted areas are the 4 deaths that actually occurred at the school, and then the yellow is the duplicates. So that's a very interesting spreadsheet, which you can take a look at, also available on Green's website. And so the death records, Green has also compiled, and you can just click on that available here link. And what I've done is I've just reproduced one of the death certificates, the death certificate of Adrian Reynolds G. George, the student who died from asphyxia. And, you might have think that he was committed suicide, or there's some kind of story that indicated malfeasance on the part of the school. But as Celia Haig Brown pointed out in her 1986 thesis, Invasion and Resistance, he died accidentally playing the game of Outlaw. And this is on page 148. And then as well, the cemetery, if you want to know the cemeteries, it was at the Lytton Reserve Cemetery. And you can see the cemeteries here on Nina Green's spreadsheet, right? So number 2 is this poor child who died of asphyxia. And it says here, Lytton Reserve in terms of the burial. And quite a few of the cemeteries are noted on this spreadsheet. And this is something that's interesting because in many of these cemeteries, there are a number of graves that are now unmarked. And that's not because they're clandestine, it's because the markers that originally were put there were made of wood and they've deteriorated, and Aboriginal communities often, because it's not part of their tradition, do not keep up grave sites. So they just kind of are reclaimed into the wilderness. And there's nothing wrong with that. You know, they're different traditions, but the problem is that there's a lot of pretense now by Aboriginal neo-tribal elites that the fact that there aren't marked graves that still continue to have the markers is some evidence of foul play, nefariousness, some kind of terrible wrongdoing that occurred. And we saw this with the Cowess's case, with Cadmus Delorme, who he knew that it was a cemetery for the community. The grave markers had deteriorated and that they'd just been cleared away, turned into a field. But even though he knew that, he stated that it was a crime scene and really played it up for the media. And I think that is disgraceful, that kind of action by these neo-tribal elites. I know there are numerous Aboriginal people who believe this, and I'm really sorry that they've been traumatized by these irresponsible kinds of announcements. But we're not talking about that with respect to some of these neo-tribal elites who are really just using this issue as an aspect of neo-tribal rentierism to extract transfers from the government. So in terms of this case of George, the child with the last name of George, this evidence of it being a hanging where playing outlaw is provided by Celia Haig Brown's thesis, her doctoral dissertation, I believe. I believe she did it in 1986 was the date of it. Okay, so an interesting thing, the reason why I've singled out this particular case is that the accidental hanging of George, last name George, this student, is possibly the source of the claim made by Audrey Baptiste that she saw 4 boys hanging in a barn. So that's the testimony that she gave for CBC investigative journalist Gillian Findlay, who knows better. That's an embarrassment, what the CBC produced in January 2022. I've got the link for that. You can watch the whole thing. It has unbelievable kinds of statements that are being made, and CBC did no investigation at all. Massive amounts of money were spent on that documentary. It has high production values, and it was just fomenting this false claim, and that is a shameful piece of quote-unquote journalism. Anyway, what I've done is I've clipped that testimony from Baptiste. She was at the Kamloops Indian Residential School from 1957 to 1964, and you can listen to her talking about the 4 boys that she saw. But this raises the question, you know, what were the names of the 4 boys? What was the actual year? Who was the principal at that time? Let's do some more investigation and not just listen to this testimony as if it were the truth, because we really need to corroborate the testimonies of these quote unquote knowledge keepers because of the problems of misremembering, confirmation bias, and the whole idea that just because I believe it, it must be true and everyone should be forced to go along with what I'm talking about. So that was the information that we had in 2023. And but what has happened recently, and my friend Kevin Byrne, I've got to thank him because he was sort of taking me to task for not being up to date on this matter, and this has prompted me to do this video, is that now we have an updated list from the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, and you can go into that by just clicking on this link. And what you'll notice here is that there's all this the list of these names with the date of death, so the date that they died. And what you're going to see is a whole bunch of names here. And what we're going to zero in on here is one of the more interesting cases that I have been examining. And there's 82 names. I've actually gone and numbered them. But what you will see, and what we're going to get into shortly, is the name of Nellie Enias, which is also spelled Ignace, Ignace. So that's going to be an important case to look at, and I'm going to explain why right now. So anyway, I've compiled this with the numbers. Nellie Enias is, I'm just looking at what, I think it's 64. That's the number. Yeah, but you can't read it very well. That's why I provide the links. So Nellie Enias is 64. And the reason why this is interesting is because Nellie Enias, or Ignace, was the sister of Mona Jules. And Jules was one of the knowledge keepers. So Jules is a designated knowledge keeper. She is just promoted all the time by the Kamloops Indian Band. So she's a revered, respected elder who cannot be questioned. That's the kind of status she has. And this is a huge problem for us now in trying to reconstruct the past, because Mona Jules is an elderly person. She went through a lot of different experiences, and she's been talking to a whole bunch of different people about these circumstances. So we don't really know what's true and what's not true that Mona Jules is talking about. And in the presentation on July 15th, 2021, Mona Jules gave about a 15-minute long presentation. And you can see that from this global news coverage of it. If you go to the timestamp of 1/28/18, that's when Mona Jules is starting to give her presentation. And in this presentation, she states that her sister, Nellie, who she didn't know, passed away in the school, and my mom and dad were not notified until after she died. And the reason why Mona Jules knows that is because she was told this by her relatives. She doesn't have any actually firsthand knowledge of it. And then she says that because her parents were not notified, her father became very upset, and she claims that he beat the principal up so badly, he knocked him down from floor to floor, and the principal ended up in hospital. And on its face, that seems like an implausible account. At least that was when I was reading it, because I think that at the time, especially many Aboriginal parents were Catholic. They would have really revered the leaders at the school, and it's hard to believe that they would have done that, but we just have to take that as a hypothesis to be investigated. Anyway, so this is the transcript at 1:39:20 when Mona Jules is talking about this. I just never spoke English, my sister and my mother. That was in 1943, I believe that was the case, so that's possible. Anyway, in 2000, Mona Jules as well has another testimony that she gave for the book Behind Closed Doors, and I have a copy of that book. And so I read the chapter that Mona Jules contributed. She was doing an interview with the editor, Agnes Jack, and on page 186, there's Mona Jules asserting that Nellie had died from, quote, hepatitis or yellow jaundice. That, according to Mona Jules. We don't know if that's true or not. We'd have to look at records. And she claims her father, again, she has to claim that he beat up the principal. And you can see that here on page 186. She was sick for months and was not taken to a doctor. And it was not until after her death that my parents were known. So this story is consistent of Jules in terms of this situation. But is it true? This is the question about this. And there seems to be some evidence to suggest that it's not. In March 31st, 1943, there is the residential school quarterly return, and it says that Nellie was in hospital. So if this is true, and I guess we have to be slightly skeptical of records, it says that Nellie was in hospital with an incurable disease, and she was to be discharged. Now, I'm not sure if she goes back to the school or whether she goes home, but certainly there seems to be evidence that she was at hospital, and we have the death certificate where she died on February 27th, 1943. And she was 14 years old when she died. And in terms of the father, or this story about the father beating up the principal, according to Marianne Ignace, who has done this genealogy, you can see Francis Edward Ignace and Melanie Basil Paul. They were married and they had several children. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 12 children. And then you see the children, Nellie and Mona. So they are the daughters of Francis Edward. So that's the father that we're dealing with. And then we also found out the name of the principal, who was James Fergus O'Grady. And there's a newspaper article here which is honoring him and saying what a wonderful man he was and so on. And maybe that was false deference to someone who did terrible things in the residential schools, but still at the time there didn't seem to be any objections to him being honored in this way. And in order to figure out Mona Jules's claims, you need to go to the records. You can't just take Mona Jules's word for these things, because we've seen again and again that the knowledge keepers, they're not reliable. So they have, it's been a long period of time. It's known that length of time makes it difficult to remember. And as well, there's the Kevin Annett factor. Kevin Annett has been involved in putting forth these stories since the 90s. We have Unrepentant comes out in 2007 with all sorts of lurid tales. And we also have Behind Closed Doors, which on page 183, this is about the apple orchard. So we're concerned about the clandestine burials claim at KRS. And she says in this page of Behind Closed Doors that this is the part that I've done a highlighted of. Some of the braver girls would run down into the orchard and steal some apples. It had a big fence around it and it was guarded by dogs. Out here where you see the apple trees grow now. So she's talked to Agus Jack in front of the museum. There seemed to be a lot of more fruit in there back then. It was just full of all kinds of fruit. We were never allowed into it. So that's all she has to say about the apples and the apple orchard. Now, Mona Jules is a knowledge keeper. And as I say here, one would have expected her to be aware of the supposed burials in the apple. If she's a person who carries forward the traditions and is listening to all the stories, none of these stories were being made before 2021, except by Billy Coombs and Jessie Jules, and both of those figures were closely tied to Kevin Annett. So they are not reliable witnesses, but they're the only ones before 2021. After the Kamloops band made the announcement, many came forward with all these kinds of tales. So that's obviously a case of implanting of false memories, because they would have said it before. And as we know from the Native task force that the RCMP did, and this is going to be coming out in the documentary that Simon Hergott and I are producing, is that there was no mention of graves, clandestine burials, anything like that. That never came forward in the 90s. And, Charlene Bello, who was the liaison, she's a major figure now. So it wasn't as if they didn't have Aboriginal involvement. Another factor we've got to consider is the reunion. So there was a reunion in 1977. They had a souvenir edition publication on this, and you see Mona Jules was a dancer, and she won the Nora Bullman Cup for her dancing. And this again raises the question is, how horrible is a kind of a residential school when it has these kinds of activities and everything? Like, that shows some regard for the children and how they're doing. And then we have the list of people who attended the reunion, which is a guest book with 280 former students and staff signing it. And then I mention here that there's a couple of people that we want to be especially interested in. One is Bishop Fergus O'Grady, who was the one who was supposedly beaten up by Mona Jules's father. And the other is Chief Harvey McLeod of the Upper Nicola band. And the reason why we're interested in the Fergus O'Grady signing it is because, here's this horrible guy who never, let the parents know that their child was in hospital, which seems to be unlikely. Anyway, everyone's going there, rubbing shoulders with him, celebrating him. So that doesn't seem to be, very likely again for that story. And then we have the case of Harvey McLeod. And Harvey McLeod was interviewed by Gillian Findlay again in the Fifth Estate in January 2022. That's when it aired. And he said in this interview that he was given a box to put in the furnace room and a baby fell out. So it's being stated in this documentary that is done by the CBC that babies were being thrown into furnaces. And if Chief McLeod attended this reunion, which evidence seems to indicate, why would he be interacting with staff members who he believes were throwing babies into the furnace? And we have clipped that segment. You can watch that on Twitter if you so choose. Sorry, I just want to stop the share here. Okay, so just in conclusion here, in terms of what we've discovered, and this is Nina Green, so this is not my legwork. This work has been done by Nina Green, but I'm just kind of compiling it and trying to present it in a form that is easily digestible. In terms of the deaths that we know were at the Kamloops Indian Residential School, in terms of the 49, 4 out of the 49 seem to have died at the residential school. And then one of them was this kind of accidental hanging, which, while tragic, I guess the school might have been watching them more, but you can't letting children play and so on. That child was buried in a cemetery in Lytton, the Lytton Reserve Cemetery, so there's no mystery about where that child was buried. And there's about 30 cemeteries that are named in there. So these cemeteries have many unmarked graves because of the lack of traditions about keeping up burial plots. And if the Aboriginal Neo-Tribal elites are so concerned about not knowing where children are buried, why aren't they not going into those reserve cemeteries to do that? And the reason is that, this whole issue is really being used by the Aboriginal industry to foment anger and grievances so that more lawsuits, more legal kinds of processes, more consultant work searching for unmarked graves and so on can go on. And this is a huge problem now. This is a nationwide issue. We need a reckoning on this. First of all, because we're interested in the truth. So we need to have the truth about Kamloops. This is very, very important. If we don't have truth, if we can't get truth on Kamloops, forget anything else. Because that shows that we are just lost as a civilization. Secondly, Aboriginal people, it's being said over and over again that they were traumatized by this announcement. And as we saw from Gabrielle Weaselhead, she's saying that she had to go and she talked to her mother and she was crying and so on. We need to reassure, if it's not true, this will reduce trauma for Aboriginal people. And the Kamloops Indian Band has received $12.1 million to do the excavations. I believe $3.2 million specifically on the excavations. And that's how we can reduce the trauma, find the truth about Kamloops, and create a more realistic footing so that we can go forward and try to understand in more detail and with more nuance what happened at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. I hope you have found this video to be informative. And if you're going to be in Kamloops on November 12th, please join us in discussing these matters at Thompson Rivers University. Student Street, 1:00 p.m. Have a great day.